One of the things that Hawkins points out is that when people begin to raise the energy level at which they are vibrating themselves, through their thoughts and through their spirit and through their actions and so on, that you impact those around you in new and more exquisite ways. And some of the most interesting experiments that I've seen are not so much on the impact of how meditation helps to raise frequencies. It's funny that you slow down your thoughts and you slow all of that down. And when you do that, you are absolutely raising the frequency at which you vibrate. And when you're able to do that, if you were to meditate yourself around a group of people and go into a deeper and a higher state of consciousness, you would raise the serotonin level not only of yourself, which are just these enzymes in the blood, which are the peace enzymes, if you will. You would raise it in the people around you as well. That all of us have this thing called an energy body. And this energy body is something that we radiate outward. And you know intuitively that there's something to this, that there's certain people that when they come into your energy field will lower your energy, and they will drain some of your energy. And there are certain people, as they move in closer to you, you start feeling better. You start breathing a little different. You start having that kundalini, that movement of energy, like a warm shower running inside of you. And you sense that when other people are at these higher levels, and even animals sense it. And it's one of the things that Patanjali wrote about 2,300 years ago. He said, when you become steadfast in your abstention of thoughts of harm directed toward others, all living creatures will cease to feel enmity in your presence. So that if you reach a very high level of consciousness, which you had when you were a child, it's just remembering it, then butterflies will come and land on your shoulder. And dogs that were barking, you can absolutely bring a sense of peace to them and make them quiet down or be less vicious. And certainly you can impact it on babies. There are some people who the baby cries no matter who it is, right? I've had parents tell me that. This baby cries for everyone. I've never seen you picked up that baby and the baby stopped crying. My baby has never, ever not cried in the arms of a stranger except with you. And I say it's just bringing in a different energy into the baby's energy field. And this isn't anything that we can necessarily measure or we can identify specifically. It's just something that everybody, as I'm talking about it in the room, particularly you mothers, your heads go up and down because you know. You have a knowing about this. So one of the things that he talks about, in every studied case of recovery from hopeless and untreatable disease, there has been this major shift in consciousness so that the attractor patterns that resulted in the pathologic process no longer dominated. This is from Power versus Force, David Hawkins. In every studied case of recovery from hopeless and untreatable disease, now this isn't just physical disease, there has been this major shift in consciousness so that the attractor patterns that resulted in the pathologic process no longer dominated. So the question is, what is it that dominates in our consciousness? And if what we allow to dominate our consciousness is an attractor pattern of anger, of hatred, of self-pity, of fear, of worry, of shame, of these very low and slow energies, all of which are measurable. If this is what we are radiating out, we attract that back into our lives. And when we begin to make the shift away from those lower and slower energy patterns in our natural way of reacting, even to things such as hatred and even to things such as anger, because the problem with force is that force always creates a counterforce. And it's one of the reasons that mankind hasn't moved up hardly at all on the level of collective consciousness in 2,000 years. Because whenever you use force, you have a very low and a very slow energy. Anger and hatred, these are all slow energies. And when you react to that force with more of a counterforce, you have lowered the collective energy that you're in. So that if a child says to you, I hate you, and screams that out as a 2 or 3-year-old just who's frustrated, I hate you, Mommy, I hate you, Daddy, and you respond back with, well, I hate you too, which is absurd because you know better than to do that. But if you do, what you do is you lower the energy, you create a counterforce, and you have collectively created a lower energy than when you just had one person who was at hatred or a low, slow energy, okay? So that what you do in response to a child's hatred is you respond with either removing yourself so that the energy field doesn't get magnified, or consoling, or finding a way to let them know that I love you despite how you're acting here. And this is our instinct to do that. When bad things happen in the world, what we call bad things, which are really low energy things, when violence comes, when planes fly into the World Trade Center, when war strikes, when there are hurricanes, when there are earthquakes, when disasters, when low energy appears in humanity, our instinct is what? Our instinct is to help. Our instinct is to get into, if we're in Iowa and something happens in New York, is to get in a fire truck and drive the fire truck to New York and walk into burning buildings to save people. Our instinct is to go right away to the Red Cross and say, can I donate some of my blood? Let me give you some of my mojo. Let me give you my life force. Okay, here, take my blood. My blood, I mean, what a symbol that is. Take what is keeping me alive and give some of it to, and we give so much of it that we had to absolutely destroy some of the blood because there was too much given. Because our instinct is, in the moment of hatred, is to respond with love. That's our natural instinct to do so, is to seek out to help. If somebody's house burned down, on the whole history of our people, when someone's house burns down in any village, everybody in the village comes together and says, how can we help to rebuild your house? And it's not an uncommon theme, is it? And it isn't just that. It's in fact, it hardly even makes news. When there are doctors in the world who are highly trained people who could be making a fortune, who go off and donate their time in places where people don't have any medical services. The Peace Corps, the concept of the Peace Corps, the concept of reaching out and helping others who are in lesser conditions than we are, is instinctive. When a baby wakes up in the middle of the night screaming, I hate you, only they just do it with wah, wah, and that's annoying. I know. I've experienced that many, many times, being sound asleep and having a tiny little baby. Wah, wah. You don't look at that little baby and say, wah, well, wah, back right at you. You don't do that. You put a breast in their mouth, mothers, and you console them by giving them your life force and saying, here, take this. This will make, and it always works. In fact, I'm 61 years old. And if you put a breast in my mouth for 4 hours, I'm as happy as it's possible for a person to be. It works every time, 61 years later, right? And all of the men in the room are nodding, saying, I know what you're talking about. Because it's our instinct to respond to lower energy with a higher energy to nullify it. But when we use force, which is what we do collectively, is why we still have wars. We use force to respond to force, you lower the energy. And an attractor pattern is nothing more than bringing a higher energy. When I have people come to me and say, okay, I love what you're saying, it all makes perfect sense to me, but you don't know who I'm living with. And you don't know how difficult it is. You don't know what my children are like. You don't know what my spouse is like. You don't know about the person that I work with every day, who is my boss, who is just totally inconsiderate and is totally. And I always remind them that when a great spiritual teacher They said of Jesus, when he would walk into a village, just his presence in the village and nothing more would raise the consciousness of those around him. When Mother Teresa walked into a room, the energy of the room changed just by being in her presence. When I walked into a room with Mother Mira, this beautiful soul who has an ashram over in Germany from India, and when she walked into the room and she radiates out at a very different spiritual energy, everyone calmed down. There was a sense of peace, a sense of faster energy. Not better energy. It's not about good and bad. It's not about moral and immoral. Because that's why I say in Spiritual Solution to Every Problem, you don't have any problems, though you think you do. The problems are all these things that are in the world of problems, the world of the physical. But if you die while you're alive, what you do is you enter into the world of spirit in which there is no form, and then you start to bring that over here to these lower energies, and you dissolve it. The attractor patterns, you can't give away what you don't have. You can only give away what you do have, but more than that, you are continuing to attract into your life the lower energies of force. Shame is the lowest energy that is measurable on the map of consciousness scale. So if you use shame with yourself, you will always weaken yourself. If you use shame on other people in your parenting and so on to try to get your children to be ashamed in order to teach them something, it will always backfire on you. And I'll talk more about that in the 10th principle. But I'd like to share with you a letter. It's a letter that I received from a woman who gave me permission to use it. And it's really about what I'm speaking about. I asked her if I could use it, shared it in some of my talks, because I think that if, particularly the women listening here, and those of you here in the room today, were ever to encounter the kind of hatred that this woman, Ruth, her name is Ruth Carrico, encountered, it might teach you something. It was, I'm going to share the whole letter. She says, Dear Dr. Dyer, I can't tell you what a privilege it will be to meet and hear you in person, and I've been trying to figure out a way to tell you how your message has affected my life, so here goes. 4 years ago, after going back to Rhode Island for my brother's daughter's wedding over Memorial Weekend, I returned to Sacramento as usual. About 6 weeks later, my brother was having problems with his equilibrium and ended up in the hospital. Within a few days, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer in his brain stem. They did try to do some special procedures which postponed his death for a few months, but he ultimately died a year later. This was not just any brother, it was my closest and dearest family member. He was a year and a week younger than I, and we have been emotionally like twins all of our lives. So needless to say, this was quite devastating to me. I just didn't know how to handle it emotionally and could not return back to Rhode Island to see him again, although he did make a trip out here to see everyone before he died. Well, I stressed so much that it began to affect me physically in my muscles, which got weak and sore, and I was on a path to a possible autoimmune disorder. I am in the insurance and financial planning business and meet with people at their homes. One of my clients who became aware of my struggle has several of your tapes and your tape sets and offered to loan them to me. I started listening to the tapes, and the part that really was of tremendous help was when you talked about how to handle things that are out of your control and accepting things that happen in life rather than letting them negatively affect your life. Anyway, as I listened to them, I was able to incorporate them into my life, and by this time my brother died, I was much more at peace in accepting the loss. The town where we grew up and he died in is on the ocean and has wonderful beaches and shoreline. The morning of his funeral, I woke up very early and just walked the beaches and sat on the big rocks by the ocean, listening to the waves, meditating, thinking about my brother and our life together, and feeling the peace I needed to bury my beloved brother that day. I cannot tell you how helpful those tapes were and continue to be in my life. With the help of the tapes and nutrition supplements, I was able to regain my health almost completely over the months that followed. About 9 months after my brother's death, about the middle of March, In the following year, I started listening to the same tapes again, starting on a Monday morning. Little did I know when I listened to them Monday through Thursday as I worked out early in the mornings in a health club, as I have been doing for years, how they would again be such a help to me. On Friday morning, about 2:30 a.m., I was awakened from my sleep by a masked man who was holding a knife at my throat. At first, I thought I was just having a nightmare, but then soon realized that I was in real time and this person was really there, and needless to say, I was terrified. He asked me quite a few questions as he put tape over my face from above my eyes to halfway over my mouth, and then taped my hands behind my back and cut my nightgown and underwear with a knife. I realized that I had a choice to fight him and possibly get hurt badly, or just quietly go along with it and hope for the best. I chose the latter, and as he touched me, I was able to detach myself from what was happening to a degree, and then suddenly I got really calm, and I started talking to him. The thoughts from the tapes must have come back to me because the words I said were not what one would just naturally say in this situation. He told me he was from LA and needed money and a car to return back there. The words came out of me. I don't know where they came from. You're such a nice young man. Would you like me to pray for you? God help this nice young man to get the money he needs to go to LA and help him to be happy and to have a good life. I asked him if he had a girlfriend, and he said yes, in LA. I then asked him if he had any children, and he said no. Would I be here if I had any children, he said. I said, well, I have children and I have grandchildren, and they are so wonderful. You should get together with your girlfriend and have children someday. They really are wonderful. I continued to talk to him as if he were a nice man. And he eventually said, this isn't working, and never did actually rape me. He still did more, though, and I thought that this was possibly going to be the end of me, but he eventually left, and on his way out he said to me, you're a nice lady. I totally attribute my ability to be calm and use kind words in this situation to having listened to your tapes, which I know without a doubt came back to me, gave me that extraordinary peacefulness and strength and words of kindness. And now I want to thank you very much for sharing your life and wisdom, which have provided such wonderful alternatives to getting caught up in things. I can't say I have perfectly mastered this, but I am surely much more aware of how to handle some very difficult circumstances, and the personal growth has been very evident in how I react to life. Recently, I was again in a situation that really took extraordinary wisdom and strength to do what seemed right when others criticized. I am totally at peace now with knowing that I did the right thing, and it is resulting in life changes. Thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your wonderful books and tapes. They are so much more than just written and spoken words. I am also exceedingly grateful to the person who shared them with me and have told him so. He too will be in attendance in Sacramento. That's from Ruth Carico. Now, I don't read that because I believe I had anything to do with it. It wasn't me or my tapes. It was a different energy pattern. The energy to write and speak and say the things that I am doing right here, I'm speaking from my heart throughout this entire program. When I start speaking, I don't even know what I'll say at the end. But I always recall what it says in A Course in Miracles. If you knew who walked beside you at all times on this path that you have chosen, you could never experience fear again. And what Ruth did in that horrifying, terrifying moment that must be too difficult to even contemplate for most people. What she did is she brought a higher and a faster energy in that moment of hatred, as Francesco implores us, where there is hatred, let me sow love. And in the worst of moments, she was able to bring something, some modicum of love, or higher, faster energy, and in some way was able to dissolve it. Now, most of us won't be faced with that kind of terror or with that kind of hatred, and yet hatred is very much a part of what we experience in our lives and in our world. Collectively, mankind still responds always, almost always, to hatred with more of the same. And the faces of who we are told to hate just keep changing, while hatred itself is the enemy, because when it's there and we respond to it with more of the same, we attract into our lives the exact same thing that we don't want to see going on. Truly, you can't give away what you don't have. But more than that, what you are giving away is what you continue to attract into your life. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Isn't that some letter? I mean, I read that and I met her, and I've had other people tell me similar stories in those moments of the most fear, that if you can just figure out a way to raise the energy just a little bit and bring something higher. Any thoughts, observations, questions? Yes. Carol?
I just had a beautiful experience this morning jogging early. There were a number of jackrabbits out, and one ran along with me for some of the way, so it fits in with what you said. It was just lovely.
We got St. Francis over here now, right? That's great. I have a little girl, Sage, the one who healed herself of her bumps, who whenever we walk in the rainforest on Maui, the butterflies go by everybody else, and they just land on her. And she just says, "Watch, Dad." And she has the most love for animals of any human being I've ever known. I mean, she can't, you have to escort cockroaches out of the house. She just can't stand the idea of harming anything. This is the fourth principle along the road that is less crowded. And the reason that I say it's never crowded along the extra mile is because where most of the people are, it's very, very noisy. And this principle is called embracing silence. If you want to really move into the higher levels of consciousness, if you want to understand what it means to really live a life of inner peace and feel successful in your life, then silence is something you must not only learn to be comfortable with, but something you must demand, seek out, and insist upon in your life. When I speak about a sense of inner peace, I think that if I were given the opportunity to have one of two choices, one choice would be that I could have anything that I ever wanted in the physical sense. So that if I wanted a new car or new jewelry, or if I wanted to have a vacation home, someplace that is exotic, or all the money I could ever want, and so on. That in lieu of that, I had to make a different choice, and that was the choice to know that whatever it is that came my way, any time in my life, for the rest of my life, I would be able to have a sense of inner peace, that nothing could take me away from that peace. I think I would always choose the latter. And I think as I talk to most people, when you look at why you want things, what you'd like to accumulate in your life, it often just boils down to, it would make me feel more peaceful. I would feel as if I had more of a grounding and a connection to God. So when I talk about these 10 principles of achieving a higher state of peace, I'm really talking about the thing that motivates almost all of us. We'd like to know that if something happens in our lives that is terrifying, that is something that is totally unexpected, if something happens to a loved one, to one of our children, to our spouse, if I suddenly am faced with a debilitating disease myself, if all of the things that I treasured suddenly were threatened and taken away, if I was forced to deal with a lawsuit that was unexpected, if I had to deal with seeing my children go off to war, whatever it might be that we think of as ultimate struggles in our lives, is there a place inside of me? Is there a place that I can go? Is there something that I can do to bring about a sense of peace in my life? And then I can deal with whatever it is that I'm confronted with. And make no mistake about it, we're all going to be confronted with these things that are going to be struggles, difficulties, obstacles. We're going to have our expectations disconfirmed. It's going to happen. It's part of what we signed up for when we incarnated as human beings. But it doesn't have to be a problem. And it doesn't have to be something that we do without a sense of peace. And in all of my lecturing and studying and living over the past 61 years, what I have discovered for myself is that it can't be done without silence. And that silence is a great friend. And silence isn't just a wonderful experience of peace. It is much, much more than that. First of all, Herman Melville, one of my very favorite people, wrote one time that God's one and only voice is silence. And Blaise Pascal, a great scientist from an earlier century and a great philosopher, once observed that all of man's troubles stem from his inability to sit quietly in a room alone. That most of us are just not very good at that. That when we tell people to go to their room and be there by yourself, we think of that as the ultimate punishment. And in a prison, the worst place that you can go is to a place called solitary confinement. I think about a man who was released from prison in 1990. And I remember the day very, very well. I remember watching on television with great anticipation as Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And we had all heard stories about the possibilities in the late 80s of this man possibly being released and maybe not, but no one had seen a picture of him because no photos were allowed. And he had spent 27 years in isolation, 17 of them in a place called Robben Island, off the coast of Cape Town. And I remember the day that he walked out, and I saw this dignified man walk out, and all of the world's anticipation had been on what was going to happen in South Africa as a result of the dismantling of apartheid, which is an idea whose time had finally come. And it was no longer going to be possible for them to have on the books, the law books, and a law that said that one group of people, because of their racial makeup, because of the color of their skin, was inferior to another group of people. It was the last place. I remember I was a host on a TV show. I filled in for a friend of mine. His name was Dennis Holy. And he had a show on PBS at night, every night, called Late Night America. And he asked me if I would substitute for him when he was on vacation one week, many years ago. And my very first guest was a man named Dick Gregory, who was a former comedian and a man who was a great hero to me because I thought I had done something really phenomenal by running a marathon. When I completed my first marathon, I told everybody I had run 26 miles and how great that was, and I was really feeling pretty strong in my late 30s to run 26 miles without stopping in around 3 hours. And then when I found out, when I was doing the review material to interview Dick Gregory, I discovered that he ran 2 marathons every day for 70-some consecutive days from Los Angeles to New York to protest the war in Vietnam. 52 miles a day he ran. So I stopped. I wasn't going to brag to him about my completing 1 marathon and then having to sit in a hot tub for a week. And at any rate, he was a wonderful man. He is a wonderful man. And a man of great conviction and who stood up and spoke about injustices at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco many years ago. I went there to see him. And he said something to me. He said that night on the TV show, he said, "You are going to be a very well-known spokesman for the ideas that you are writing about. Much more well-known than you even anticipate right now." And he said, "There's one thing that you have to do." He said, "You have to go to South Africa. And you have to talk to the people in South Africa. And the reason you have to go there is because it's the only place left on the planet in which the laws are still in place, which make one group of people inferior to another. And once those laws have been removed and abolished, consciousness will take over. But as long as those laws are on the books, people will use them as a reason to continue this kind of thing called apartheid." And I was, I don't know what year that was, but it was in the late 70s, and I was sort of flattered, but I didn't really think too much about that. But it was always on my mind whenever I would read about South Africa. I could never shake that what Dick Gregory had said to me. And then I started hearing about Nelson Mandela. And I began to read more about South Africa and what was happening there. And finally, I ended up going to South Africa in the year 2000. And I happened to be there on the exact 10th anniversary of Nelson Mandela's release from prison. And I went to Robben Island, and I went to the cell where he had lived in isolation for so many years. And I went out to the limestone quarries where he had to bust limestone in the brilliant sun. That's why his eyes are so squinted and so on. And I had a sense of something very powerful. This man walked out of prison after 27 years of being innocently incarcerated. And almost all of those years he was in silence. Deep silence, enforced silence. And he somehow was able to make conscious contact, in my estimation, with God. And he came out of that prison not with revenge and not with hatred and not with anger in his heart. He came out of that prison with forgiveness and reconciliation and nothing more in his heart. And it was through his conscious contact with God in that silence that he was able to find a way to turn what was potentially a volatile experience. War was predicted because 3 million people were telling 17 million people that they were inferior, and it just looked like a bloodbath was going to ensue, not only in South Africa, but in all over Africa, which had been colonized and had been experiencing apartheid in just a little different form for centuries. And this one man with this visionary consciousness that I believe came about because of his experience of silence, of getting quiet. And that when we go into that silence, we experience something that is unlike anything that we experience anyplace else. Such, I think, is the power of silence, that it was really not only transformative in South Africa, but I believe that Nelson Mandela, who left a copy of his book there for me, called Long Walk to Freedom, and signed it personally to me, because he couldn't be there. He was up in Zimbabwe, negotiating some peace between some of the tribes there, and left me a note and a signed book, which I, of course, treasure. And when I spoke in South Africa, I spoke about this, and I didn't think anybody would be there who would come to hear me speak. I had never even been to South Africa. And they were lined up around the block to get in. People of all races and descriptions in Cape Town and in Johannesburg. And I'll be going back there in a very short time to speak again. And I had a very strong sense that this person was, in his silence, discovered something that we can all discover, something about reconciliation, and something about making conscious contact with God. So, how do we pursue this silence, and why did Melville say, God's one and only voice is silence? I think it's important to understand this intellectually, and then to go about looking for ways to bring it into your life, and to understand it more deeply. God's one and only voice is silence means that God is that which is indivisible. There is no place that God is not. And you can't divide God up and say that God is on this side or God is on that side. I've often said that God isn't doing anything different now than God was doing an hour ago or 100 years ago. And God isn't doing anything different now than he will be doing 1,000 years from now. God is exclusively here and now, not elsewhere, not in heaven someplace apart from us, but here, now, and indivisible. And the word indivisible is very important, because that which is everywhere and cannot be separated or carved up is something that we have a great deal of difficulty in the world of the physical form experiencing and understanding. Because our world, the world of you listening here, is a world of dichotomies. It's a world of paradoxes. We divide everything up. I used to teach a course in metaphysics at St. John's University many years ago in New York. And I used to tell my students when they came in that if you could come into the room next week with just the North Pole of a magnet and no South Pole, you'll get an A in the course. And you don't even have to come back. And there was never a person who could ever bring in just the North Pole, because no matter how thin you sliced it, there was always its counterpart. There was always the South Pole. And dichotomies are just our way of being. We divide everything in the world up. The only reason we know that something called darkness exists is because of light. If there was nothing called light, we wouldn't know anything called darkness. The only reason we have a concept called up is because we have something of its reverse called down. You've never seen a person with a front who doesn't have a back. You've never seen a person with an outside who doesn't have an inside. We divide everything. Everything is in the world of the divisible. In the Bhagavad Gita, it speaks about transcending the dichotomies, figuring out a way to get past the up-down, the male-female, the good-bad, the right-wrong, the old, the new, the alive and the dead. Everything has its dichotomy. You can always find its opposites. In fact, that's how the symbolism of language is created, through having opposites. We don't know about oneness in the physical world. Everything has its counterpart, its dichotomy, except for silence. Silence is the only experience that is the same as God. It is indivisible. You take silence, and we'll have some right now, and now let's just cut that in half. And what do we have? More silence. Let's take what we've cut in half and cut it in half again and again. And endlessly you attempt to divide into a dichotomy, silence, but you can never do it, because silence is indivisible. And silence is God's one and only voice. When you go into silence, you go into the place where you make conscious contact with God, whatever it is that God means to you. You make conscious contact with that omnipotent, omniscient force in the world, that omnipresence of God. And the reason I say that it's not crowded along the extra mile is because the mile that most people are on is a very, very noisy mile. And I encourage young people to become more comfortable with silence. We live in a world of bulldozers and leaf blowers and trucks that make endless amounts of noise and chatter. And constantly, I have a home, a place a retreat that I go to frequently on Maui. And oftentimes I will walk in the morning and they're in a big building project in Maui. And I'll go past one building after another and start to count the noisemakers as all of these machines and all of these people who are trying to make the place look so pristine and so beautiful and so landscaped, instead of just letting it grow, just letting it be. I remember driving through a neighborhood one time. I was speaking in a place I think it was in Athens, Georgia, and the lady was driving me through this town, and then she went to this real sort of more upscale neighborhood, and she looked and they were all manicured lawns, and then there was one lawn that hadn't been touched at all. The people there had just allowed everything to grow and be exactly as God intended it, and she was sort of apologizing for this particular lot. And that was the only home that I wanted to go in. I wanted to meet those people. So these are my kind of people. That when I see everything looking exactly manicured, when I see trees shaped in the form of polar bears, there's a little nausea that often comes over me. It's like, trees don't grow like that. You know, everything isn't an exact linear perfection. And it is in the creation of all of these things that we call beauty that we have to pay a price. We have to pay a price with the air being polluted with all of these machines. We have to pay a price with our ears being polluted with the endless amounts of noise that you hear in trimming and cutting and all of the kinds of things that just are a part of our world. And when you get out into our world and get onto the freeways and see the cement that has been covered over the entire planet. But I always take comfort in a line that I heard from a set of tapes on ecology that said that nature always bats last. I always liked that. It was just the whole idea. What this guy was saying was that if you take and you cement over the entire planet, somewhere down the road, even if it takes 100,000 years, there will be one blade of grass that will shoot up right in between those cracks someplace. And then it'll start all over again. In another million or billion years, we'll have a Super Bowl. Nature always bats last. And I think that just making that intellectual awareness, that intellectual concept, that silence and God are one because you can't divide either one of them. Okay? So that going to silence as frequently as you can and understanding that out of silence, everything is created. The words that you are listening to right now as I speak emerge from silence. That silence is the source. And it's the source that is what we want to make conscious contact with. Like the source of all light is the sun. And the only reason we know about light is because of something called darkness. But when you go to the source can't be divided. And it's going to that source, that continuous ability to make that conscious contact with the source of everything, that all creation, everything that is created in our world, comes out of that void, out of that silence. I've had many people who have written me letters over the years who have told me that they have been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Or people have told me about family members who have been diagnosed with some kind of an illness that was to be permanently disabling or even fatal. And I remember a woman who was a patient of mine many years ago when I had a practice, who had a similar kind of diagnosis. And my view always is that that miracles are always possible, and that we don't ever want to give up hope. You heard me quote Michelangelo, the greater danger is not that our hopes are too high and we fail to reach them, it's that they are too low, and we do. And I've received a lot of criticism for telling people on the air to never give up hope and to never buy into the idea that something is impossible, because the moment that you do, you'll put your attention on it's impossible, and it's impossible is what will manifest and show up into your life. You'll act upon what you think about. But this particular woman, she decided that her life was too noisy. And by noisy, I mean that she had a family, she had children and a husband who all had demands on her all the time. She was trying to run a business, and that business was making demands on her all the time. She never felt that she had any time to herself. And as a result, she was in a constant inner state of stress and anxiety. And it was something that she had been feeling for many, many years. And then she had this diagnosis of some kind of a cancer, I believe it was, that it was And she was told that she only had a certain amount of time, that it was a virulent form of this cancer. And she made a decision. And she said that I am going to go into silence for as long as it takes. And she went to a place, I believe it was up in Minnesota or Wisconsin, way up north. And she rented a cabin, and she didn't tell anybody where she was going. I was the only one who knew. And she went into silence. And the only sounds that she would hear were the sounds of God, the sounds of nature. She would listen to the wind. She would listen to the birds. And each day she would find herself more comfortable with this silence, with the conscious contact with God. And she stayed there for the first month, and then she called, and then she decided that she was going to stay for another month. And she said, I know my family is worried about me, but I've assured them that I'm safe and that I'm fine. And she didn't even tell them that she had this illness. And she absolutely stayed in this state of communion with nature for 7 or 8 months, until she felt that she could come out and be at peace, and that it was this wilderness as therapy that she decided to try for her own self in her own life. And I haven't seen her in, this was 25 years ago, but about 12 years ago, I received a Christmas card from her, and she hadn't gone back to any doctors when she returned from the wilderness. And she said what she discovered there in the wilderness was the big picture, what she called the big picture. And as a result, she felt that a healing had taken place in her life through making conscious contact with God. Now, this isn't a prescription for everybody who has a serious illness. I'm just telling you that this particular person's approach to healing, and healing doesn't have to be from a serious physical disability. Healing can be from anything that seems to be disruptive in your life. That the comfort you'll experience, the comfort that you'll feel when you allow yourself to go into silence. The problem for most of us in the Western world is that we have been conditioned to believe that silence is uncomfortable. When we're in a car with another person and the conversation, that is the chatter, stops, there are uncomfortable moments very often, unless there's an understanding that silence is okay. I know that being a guest frequently on talk shows is not a good thing to practice this because you're known as a guest who can't speak. But somehow figuring out a way to get comfortable with this silence, and also to get comfortable with something else, and that is the ability to get past the mind. In David Hawkins' book, new book, The Eye of the Eye, he says, the letting go of thinkingness is facilitated by the awareness that the spiritual viewpoint that all thoughts are vanities with no intrinsic reality or value. Their attraction stems from the exaggerated value that accrues from their being considered as mine. All of these thoughts, these are my thoughts. And therefore they're special, and they're worthy of respect and admiration and careful preservation. These things called my thoughts. To undo the grip of the mind, which is what I'm asking you to look at here, requires a radical humility and an intense willingness to surrender its underlying motivations. This willingness receives energy and power from the willingness that arises from the love of God and the passion of surrendering love of thought for love of God. Surrendering love of thought, all of these thoughts that I have, to love of God, to making conscious contact with God. And what I'd like to do here is to offer a couple of suggestions. Many of you listening are aware that I produced a CD and a tape many years ago that was based upon a teaching that came to me from a man in India named Sri Guruji, whom I dedicated one of my books, Manifest Your Destiny, because he taught me about a meditation that I had only read about in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, called How to Know God, written 2,300 years ago. And in these sutras that I studied when I wrote A Spiritual Solution to Every Problem, and even when I was writing Wisdom of the Ages, in studying these sutras, Patanjali referred over and over again to this particular sound, and that this sound was an access dimension between the world of the physical, that is the world of these things that we call problems, and the world of the spiritual, which is the thing that we want to bring to the presence of these problems. It's that higher energy that I talked about earlier. And that the way that you access it is through the repetition of these sounds. Because in the New Testament, the opening lines of the New Testament say, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And he sent me this tape and a letter and encouraged me to, and he was a great teacher. He had read a book I had written called You'll See It When You Believe It. And he asked me to become a teacher of this meditation, to get 1% of the population doing this meditation that is called japa, which is nothing more than the repetition of the sound that is in the name of the Creator. The sound of Ah, the sound of God, the sound of Allah, the sound of Jehovah, the sound of Kali Durga, the sound of Ra. And this sound that is in the name for the Creator is the opening line of the New Testament for a reason. That when you repeat this sound, and I'm not going to do it here because I've done it in other places, and those of you listening who would like to know how to do it and have me guide you through it, it's in a CD called Meditations for Manifesting. And it opens up an entire new possibility of repeating the sound of the name of God, putting your attention on what you'd like to manifest and have it show up. And one letter I want to share with you about that particular experience of japa, which is something that I do every day, came from a woman. Her name is Sandy Forster, and she lives down in Australia, where I spoke recently. And she started doing japa and using it as a way to attract into her life what she wanted, what she felt was missing. And this is what she said. "I am so," that's so with about 8 O's on it, "I am so excited that you are once again coming down under. I'm from the beautiful Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, and I really want to thank you in person for your part in helping to change the course of my life. Almost 2 years ago, I desperately wanted to see you when you were touring with Metaphysical Mastery. At that time, I was running a surfwear company here on the Sunshine Coast that I had started so I could be my own boss, not realizing that that would mean I'd end up having no time for myself or my children because I'd be doing nothing but working. That business got me into so much debt, over $100,000, and I was receiving the sole parent's pension just to help me survive financially. My stress levels were through the roof, and I was financially, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually a mess. Then I began to have a physical challenge. That's when I knew it was time to stop. Don't ask me why I waited that long. But I had no idea what else I could possibly do. I had no real skills or expertise in any area. And all I really wanted was to be able to spend time looking after myself and watching my children grow. But I dreamed of something that would help me to experience abundance and prosperity